So good afternoon, everyone. While we're waiting for the remainder of our speakers, we have the first one here. So I'm delighted, Jenty, that you're with us and that we can hear you and you can hear us. So we are now in the fourth and final session of today. My name is Malini Mehra. I welcome everybody who is joining us today for this fantastic session, the final session of the day, which we're going to be addressing on. We are creating risk faster than we are reducing it. How the Sendai Framework can help risk-informed legislation. We have four fabulous speakers with us for this session, which will run in Cairo time from 3 o'clock to 4:30. So please just add +2 hours wherever you are, or deduct the same number. We will have some brief introductory remarks really to set the scene for myself, and then we will proceed to each speaker in turn, and then we will have hopefully around 20 minutes to half an hour of questions and engagements with all of those who have joined us today. So if I may, my name is Malini Mehra once again, and I am very pleased to hold this session in partnership with the UNDRR as the final session of the GLOBE COP27 Legislators Summit. And we join you from Cairo. We will be in Sharm from tomorrow, but today we're in Cairo on the concluding end of the GLOBE COP27 Legislators Summit. And it's my pleasure to introduce the subject to you, and in particular, make some of the links with our own work, given the relevance for legislators and that the principal audience for today are legislators. As the title of today's session underscores, the world is not on track to reduce risk. Human agency is increasing risk with impacts on human and ecosystems' health and well-being that entails costs, social, ecological, and economic. And we're decreasingly able to support this. Risk is externalized in finance and the determination of capital, balance sheets ignore material risks, including undervaluing climate change and transition risks, and the impacts on ecosystems. These have failed to be highlighted or the value of the positive social benefits of risk reduction recognized. So the real costs of extensive risk are especially undervalued, and this gap is widening as major climate change impacts rise and gather pace. Furthermore, if understanding and managing risk and building resilience is not prioritized, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, mitigating and adapting to climate change are simply not realistic. As we will hear further today, the midterm review of the Sendai Framework presents an opportunity to take stock now and address course corrections which are needed to tackle the systemic and the interconnected nature of risk. This presents a pivotal moment as we learn how to navigate COVID-19, not quite fully beyond the pandemic globally, and how to grapple with climate breakdown. Legislators and parliamentarians have a key role here to play in influencing government strategies and plans for resilience, to ensure that these include aspects of the reforms to risk governance required to enable states to be able to contend with modern 21st century complex risks and to build resilience, whether through legislators' constitutional duties of lawmaking, budgetary, public scrutiny, or seeking accountability and responsibility from the executive. Earlier this year, GLOBE published a first of its kind mapping report on climate change laws and policies in the Climate Vulnerable Forum. These is a grouping of 48 countries, and we mapped the climate change policies and legislation across the 48 countries. Our report focused on the CVF and sought to inform climate change efforts across CVF parliaments to improve scrutiny, to enable benchmarking of progress, and to accelerate delivery. We launched the report, incidentally, on 30th of June, which is the International Day of Parliamentarianism this year, to promote a key objective of the International Day, which is to promote public engagement and understanding. The initial analysis of our report shows that 85% of CVF members have climate change laws, with more than 3/4 having adopted or considered net zero targets. More than half seek to integrate mitigation, but links to adaptation and resilience are considerably weaker. And in fact, very few countries reference the Sendai Framework itself within their overarching climate change framework legislation. So these initial findings signal a vital area for legislative reappraisal to ensure that disaster risk management is integrated and DRR are integrated in climate change legislation and that framework laws are consistent with the objectives of the Sendai Framework. In our previous session today, where we were discussing what are the key ingredients for effective climate change legislation, the recommendation was made that we need to ensure that existing laws are climate proofed. And equally, we would argue that we need to see that existing laws are Sendai proofed. We would like to see these laws and the revisions to these laws and frameworks to ensure that they are consistent with the objectives of the Sendai Framework to protect nations in this era of climate impacts. And with the GLOBE 2022, which we will hear about later, this agenda has expanded to focus on much broader systemic risks to promote improved risk governance. Why are we holding this session today? Because it builds on work that we have done in the past. Just a month ago, we were very pleased to organize in partnership with UNDRR a roundtable discussion with parliamentarians on the midterm review of the Sendai Framework. And at this roundtable, parliamentarians highlighted a series of recommendations to the future implementation of the Sendai Framework, including on developing a roadmap to risk-proof the financial sector and on establishing caucuses and parliamentary committees to address risk reduction. We'll be hearing more about the outcomes and the implications of the recommendations yielded by the roundtable towards the end of today's session. But bringing us to today's session, we wish to build on the outcomes of the roundtable and, importantly, the early findings from the midterm review of the Sendai Framework and the UN Global Assessment Report 2020. So this session will discuss how we can address risk in a changing climate and create a sustainable, regenerative, and resilient tomorrow, addressing the key role that legislators must play in this endeavor. So with those initial framing remarks, I would love to introduce our first speaker, who is Jenty Kirsch-Wood from UNDRR. Jenty is the Head of Global Risk Management and Reporting at UNDRR. And for those of you unfamiliar with the acronym, it stands for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Jenty will address our world at risk, transforming governance for a resilient future. Thank you so much, Jenty. It's a pleasure to have you as our first speaker, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Malini. And I believe I have a couple of slides which should be coming up in a moment. But perhaps I can just put this in the context of the COP meeting. For us at UNDRR, we see the climate crisis as an incredible challenge and an opportunity to really build sustainable development. And we drew on many of the themes that we will discuss today in a recent report that we launched called the Global Assessment Report, Our World at Risk, Transforming Governance for a Resilient Future. Perhaps I can just kick off by giving a couple of words about UNDRR. We are essentially the United Nations risk focal point, and our aim is to act as the custodian for the Sendai Framework to reduce disaster risk and to enable the building of resilience globally. Essentially, I like to think of the Sendai Framework a little bit as, if you like, the resilience glue across a number of different global agreements. Sendai, the Paris Agreement, a number of global agreements that are aiming for genuinely sustainable development. And this is where the Sendai Framework can really accelerate and allow for resilience building. And I believe that the utility of the Sendai Framework is even more important today than ever before in the context of the climate crisis and the kind of systemic and cascading risk that we saw manifesting through systems in the COVID pandemic, but also more broadly in the sustainable development challenges that we see today. Because it's very clear we are not on track to reducing global risk. We see a massive increase in disasters driven by demographic trends, but also the changes in hazards through climate change and the way that we are choosing to develop in the future. If we look at the climate projections, droughts alone are forecast to double by 2030 and extreme temperature events set to triple. And in every year, we see the gap between the countries that can afford to adapt and those who can't growing. It's very clear that disaster losses are a massive drag on sustainable development. And so, as outlined by the Secretary General, progress on disaster risk reduction, it isn't a luxury. It's actually a precondition for sustainable development. And this, I think, is a key message for legislators today to think through: how are we going to climate proof our development? How are we going to position our countries and our jurisdictions to be able to weather the storm that is inevitably coming? And in terms of some key messages from the GAR that I think are particularly relevant for legislators today, it's really important to think about how systemic risks require legislation that is different. It's not just doing more of the same. If we're looking at systemic and cascading risks, systemic challenges require systemic solutions, and we need to foster the kinds of learning and collaboration across silos that can help us understand the kinds of risks we saw during COVID, where essentially a health crisis cascaded into an economic crisis, into an education crisis, into massive changes in urban planning. These are the kinds of agile and essentially volatile changes in our global systems that systemic risk is bringing. And so as we look at that, we can, of course, draw on incredible advances in scientific modeling and in information availability, but that will only be effective if it's backed up by capacity building and by the kinds of participatory approaches that can verify and ground truth analysis and actually co-create solutions. It's very clear there are a number of decision-making tools that can really help. There are new types of systemic risk modeling that can really help inform decision makers to look not only at what the first level impact might be, not only how many losses you lost the night after the typhoon, but can also begin to start looking at what that might be generating down the line in terms of supply chain disruptions, in terms of impacts on different sectors. The study on the slide is from St. Lucia, and this was an interesting piece of work that looked at the effect of a typhoon on essentially the destruction of a harbor and what that caused across all different SDG indicators. So those kinds of tools are there, but they're only useful if they can be combined with action from legislators, but also with the kinds of consultations to craft the decisions we need for the future. And in this sense, there's even a more fundamental question about how we're going to approach really transformative risk reduction in the face of the climate crisis and in the face of increasing risk. We need to better measure what we value. If we only are looking at direct economic losses, we are missing the benefits across people, planet, and prosperity of genuinely sustainable development and resilience building. And as legislators, you know as well, you know better than any, that representing the quality of values such as clean air, good ecosystems, effective economic development, safety, security, these are core elements, and yet they're very, very underrepresented in how we currently measure success, largely in financial terms. And so it's incredibly important that, first of all, we get better at managing and measuring long-term impacts, but also that we rework our investment and insurance incentive systems to better prioritize risk reduction and the resilience and stability it can bring. It's also absolutely critical that we build in better understanding of future climate risk and of the effects on ecosystems and on effects such as biodiversity. For example, the Netherlands has recently adjusted their financial risk management systems within the central bank to look at, for example, ecosystem assets. And when they did that, they found that 36% of their current portfolio value was actually exposed to nature-related risks. They hadn't been taking that into account, and they'd been making choices purely on the basis of economic GDP figures without looking at how preserving an ecosystem or investing in resilience could actually accelerate their development and the sustainability of the choices that they were going to make as governments. And there are examples of how we can incentivize this, and this needs to be built more into the mechanics and the decisions that governments make. Mongolia, Mexico, Sweden, and France have all issued green bonds now that are actually aimed at resilience building rather than just green growth in mitigation. There are these kinds of innovations, if they can be supported by legislators, can really help accelerate a change to a more resilient mindset. Unfortunately, however, currently only 16% of bonds, green bonds, are actually focused on resilience, and almost all of those are in developed markets. So this is again where there are opportunities to explore within governments how best we can improve. The second issue to take into account is really we need to design systems to factor in how human minds make decisions about risk. And here, really, co-creation is key. We need to communicate, we need to build dialogue, we need to engage people to understand risk, but we also need to see how decisions around risk are impacted by communication strategies and how we can create incentives that help the policymakers and the practice and the science align better. In that sense, we need to also understand better how we make decisions about risk and to factor that into our consultations, not simply present dry science and expect it to be picked up wholesale. So I'd like to just end the presentation with some thoughts. The first is we live in a time of certain uncertainty. And the first line of defense in the sense of that volatility is to reduce vulnerability, inequality, and exposure that drive disasters. Investing in understanding disasters and in understanding risk is essential, but we need to make sure that that takes into account systemic impacts and systemic solutions, and we need to work in a more transboundary and multi-sectoral way. Investments in systemic risk analysis are essential, but they don't solve all the problems. They need to be backed up by more flexible, agile consultation and governance systems. And again, by reworked financial systems that can actually value sustainable development and resilience building. And so I'd like to just end by asking you all, as legislators, some questions to ponder as you leave today's session. How agile are your planning systems to uncertainty? How quickly could your systems pivot in the face of an unexpected climate-related risk? What kind of committees handle systemic risk issues in your government? Who deals with that portfolio? What are their roles? Who's accountable? Do you have information on what drives vulnerability and exposure and what is undermining sustainable development in your government? Who's left out of some of those decisions? And what safety nets are in place to help people in the face of an unexpected shock? Does your planning and budgeting include provision for investing in resilience building and protecting essential infrastructure, not only for today, but in the climate future? Will it still be as effective in 2030 or 2050? How do you know? Have you begun to look at the cascading impacts of disasters? Have you got modeling that can do this? And if not, how might you be able to access that? And does your fiscal planning take into account not only prosperity, but the people and planet on which it depends? And how could this become more balanced in your context? And are you able to make sure that some of those systems you're putting in place are going to also be as suitable for your future children and your grandchildren? So I'd like to stop there, but I hope that this gives you a rough sense of some of the challenges ahead, but also the opportunities and the work that we can do together. Thank you very much.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Jenty, for laying out some of the key lessons from the GAR 2022, but also providing those inspirational examples and that brilliant checklist that you have ended with, which I would love to cut and paste into the chat, because that's a really great starting point for the conversation.